Hello. It's a really huge honor to be here, to stand in front of you and to stand next to the work and some of the history of the World Press. So thank you very much. I just wanted to show you guys a bit of a larger edit of my work. I haven't distributed a lot of it, so just show you a larger edit, and then after that I'd like to talk a little bit more about the deeper implications of the story and the hows and the whys of how I covered what I did. So if we could go ahead with the slides, that'd be great. Okay, so we're back at the beginning again. I promise I'll get back to talking about Standing Rock, but first I wanted to tell you a little bit about myself and how I found myself working in this area of storytelling and also specifically in Standing Rock. So I've born and raised in Alberta. That's right in the center of the Canadian prairies, and I've been there my whole life. My family also has been there for a very long time. We have about 115 years history there, and for me, I know specifically where my great-great-grandpa settled, so I know specifically which land was taken from which people, and more so I've spent time there. I've seen the shack that they lived in, and I've eaten food grown there, so I have a connection. I know specifically which time and place we arrived and what's enabled me to live in this privilege, and I also know which people have suffered for my privilege. So I do feel very personally connected to this idea of colonization, and feel personally accountable for what has happened in the 116 years or 115 years since we've been here. And with that, I have been very drawn to photographing stories of Indigenous issues. I have photographed stories of missing and murdered Indigenous women and stories of epidemic suicide rates on reserve. There's stories about just loss and higher rates of homelessness, addictions, and incarceration. But if you spend any time on these stories, the connecting thread is always colonization. It always comes back to the hurt and the way that they were really taken apart as a culture and a people. So you can't talk about anything in isolation. It always belongs in a bigger story, a bigger context. So I have also photographed stories of sovereignty at Unistoten, where they're occupying land that is unceded, and as a way to prevent the development that they don't want. So I'm pretty familiar with this process of occupying space, to physically occupy space to protect it when all of the negotiations break down and they are threatened to lose their land again. So when Standing Rock first occurred, I was not especially blown away. I was watching it, but I had photographed this before. It's a tactic that's used quite broadly. There's ongoing issues in Canada that are similar. But what was really new about Standing Rock was that it reached a critical mass, where there's literally thousands of people coming from every corner of the continent and as far away as Palestine and Australia to stand in solidarity with this same issue. So that's a groundswell, that's a significant change. And so just like a quick overview, the basic conflict in Standing Rock was that there was a lack of consultation about a pipeline that was built. And originally it was supposed to be north of the state capital, and of course they didn't want it there, so they pushed it downriver and put it right in front of, or right above, just north of the Indigenous reservation. So for me, that really typifies the double standard that can happen for Indigenous people and white people. You know, it's okay for you, but not for us. And then they were really demonized and vilified for not wanting this development and considered anti-establishment or something like that. And then within the Indigenous understanding, the Lakota people have a prophecy about the black snake. And so they further, beyond the threat to their water, like many people would not necessarily want a pipeline running underneath their main source of drinking water and water for their land. But beyond that, they also have a prophecy about the black snake and how the black snake would wind across the land, and if it was allowed to go across their territory, that it would be the introduction of a time of great evil. So there was very traditional reasons why they didn't want it as well. Right. So although the issue of the pipeline was very critical and very central, I definitely wanted to frame it inside this idea of colonization, because it isn't alone. It isn't like a separate moment. It is definitely only enabled, this conflict is only enabled by the fact that there's hundreds of years of colonization and hundreds of years of systems that have disempowered and tricked and taken away to leave them in a place where they're vulnerable like this. So the Lakota, Nakota, and Dakota people, they have the history that most of us recognize. If we have like a even just basic idea of what it is to be Native in American history, chances are you know some of the Lakota, Nakota, Dakota history. They were the people of the horses and the buffalo that had their life completely changed when the buffalo were driven to extinction and they were driven onto reserve and told to farm. They're the people who were affected by the diseases of the colonizers and lost people endlessly. They're the people who were decimated at Wounded Knee Massacre, where we saw over 150 women, men, and children all killed, basically in a misunderstanding. They're also the people of Little Bighorn, where General Custer was killed, and that also happens to be the last time that the Great Sioux Nation gathered at the Seven Council Fires, until, of course, this gathering at Standing Rock. So they really do typify what we understand of this history. And beyond that, they have had their land consistently stolen in broken treaties, which is something that we understand has happened to many people. They have had the Black Hills stolen from them for gold. They had their land encroached on and were displaced by massive damming projects that occurred in the 1960s. And all of this has sort of led them to a place where they have a long history and a long understanding of betrayal by the government and by white people. So obviously when you're going into this situation and you happen to be a white person, it might take a little bit of extra work to prove yourself and to build trust. So I knew going in that it would have to be a time investment, and so I made 4 trips over several months, and I never stayed for less than a week at a time, because it was very important for people to just generally recognize me and see that I was showing up and that it was not there for a quick hit or a day trip. So, and part of that too is that many people in the camps felt misrepresented by the media. There's a pretty big disconnect between our understanding of what happened there and what the traditional understanding is. So most of us look at it through the frame of social justice and free speech, and we think of them as protesters, and we don't particularly see that as like an insult. But for them, remembering again that this whole issue is based in a prophecy and in traditional ways, they see it as a prayer camp. The entire place was established on a sacred fire. There's prayers in the morning, starting with a water ceremony and a pipe ceremony, prayers throughout the day, sweat lodges, and the entire thing was prayer. And so they felt misrepresented in that way. And also, we might understand it as like a push for civil rights, maybe similar to what happened with African American people, but for Indigenous people, it actually is a push for sovereignty and the right to self-determination. So, although those are slight, I think they are fundamental, and I think it changes the way that you can understand what they're doing and what their goals are. So, yeah, regardless of where they started from, in the most fundamental way, the camps were really a failure in that as soon as Trump was declared president, he signed an executive order. The pipelines got their permits, they were completed, and as of early March, there was oil's been flowing underneath the Missouri River. And so if they had aimed to stop the pipeline, they didn't. And so that's a pretty depressing thing to realize. But in truth, I think that what was accomplished there was a huge connection between the community. Like I said, it was the first time that you've seen this much collaborative connection and common purpose. And there's many people there that intended to carry that forward. And I think that we would be naive if we didn't expect to see a continuation of these kinds of events going forward into the future, starting with probably Key XL. And for me personally, and also for them, I think perhaps the most profound thing that happened there was that there was many youth who perhaps for the very first time experienced a traditional way of living. So they were able to live in ceremony with elders and with horses, the way that they had many, many years ago. So for 9 months, they lived with that possibility, and I've been told many are now willing to fight for that possibility into the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amber. This is one story, but there was one of the weirdest moments in the presidential campaign when Donald Trump said that his presidency would be all about the Native Americans. And then people asked him what he meant, and by Native Americans, it turned out that he meant white Americans. So he seemed to have no consciousness whatsoever about who the natives are and who the immigrants are, if you see it that way. So this also has to do, I think, with a much bigger story that will be very important over the next 4 years. How do you see that? What do you think is going to happen next, because this seems to have awoken some kind of renewed consciousness. What do you think?
Yeah, I definitely feel that this awakening, that there is a groundswell, and I think that we'll see more of this moving forward. So I think that we have the opportunity to either support them and help to find a positive way forward, or we can wait for them to get frustrated and things to turn violent. So we have a choice of which side of this history we'd like to be on.
Thank you so much, Amber.